Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, I'm continuing on with my NestJS GraphQL and Prisma series. Specifically, we'll learn how to implement user registration with email and password. If you like my content, please follow me on Twitter, follow me on dev.to, or go to my website, thewebdevcoach.com. More importantly, subscribe to my channel and like this video. Additionally, I'd like to point out that this is the third video in a series of videos about NestJS with GraphQL. So if you get lost, please go back to the last two videos, go to the blog posts or the GitHub code. I'll link those in the description below. Let's dive right back into the project. In your terminal, go to your NestJS GraphQL tutorial that you started in the last two videos. From there, let's start the dev server. So we can use yarn start dev or npm run start dev. And unfortunately, we have an error that says cannot find module dist source main.js. Let's go into the code and figure this out. Here we are in the code in package.json. Here's my start dev and start debug scripts, and you'll see that the dist folder does not have a subfolder called source. So let's delete that, go back to our terminal, restart the dev server, and hopefully this should work. Alright, it looks like our dev server is up. Let's check the browser. If we go to localhost 3000 on port 3000 /GraphQL, you'll see the GraphQL playground. We can send a query to basically our server, which sends a query to the Prisma server, which sends a query to the database, and gets all the messages in our database, just as we left off in the videos before. Now, let's go on to user registration with with email and password. The first thing we need to do is add our user model to Prisma. To do so, let's open datamodel.prisma and add our user model. So type user, and this will be a simple user. It'll just have an ID, a email address, which is required. A reminder that the exclamation at the end of the type means it's required. So ID is required, email is required, and password is required. Next thing, we will run Prisma deploy. In my case, I'll run npx Prisma deploy because I do not have the Prisma CLI installed on my local machine. Now, what that'll do is add the user model to your Prisma database. You'll see here that everything is up to date for me, but that's because I've done this tutorial before. I already wrote this tutorial. Now, what we need to do is generate our GraphQL schema. To do that, we'll run GraphQL get schema. Perfect. Now you'll see that new schema file was updated. The schema file was updated in source Prisma schema.graphql. You'll see there's new create user, update user, delete user, upsert user, mutations, there's new queries, there's new user previous values. Basically, Prisma gave us our entire, the GraphQL schema that we'll be using. The next and last thing to get our user model basically going in Prisma is to generate the TypeScript Prisma binding. To do that, we'll run GraphQL codegen, and you'll see that it generated a new Prisma binding here. This is a TypeScript file that has the API that we'll be using. Let's go into Prisma and make sure that our user model was added to the database. To do so, run Prisma console, or in my case, again, npx Prisma console. This should open up the Prisma console in your local browser. Let's open the NestJS GraphQL tutorial. And you'll see I already have some users. Unfortunately, the emails are not unique. We probably should add a unique decoration there. But you'll see the user models are in the database, and Prisma is aware of them. Perfect. Before we continue into some NestJS, I do want to go back to our Prisma model and add that unique constraint that I mentioned. So in datamodel.prisma, add a unique decorator to the email property of the user type and run npx prisma deploy, or in your case, just prisma deploy. All right, it's done. You'll see the changes, updated field email, it became unique, and that's it. Email is now a unique property on the user model. Great, let's quickly commit our code and just write git commit add user model. And the next thing we'll want to do is create a Nest module, a Nest service, and a Nest resolver for our users, basically for the user's module. So I'm going to copy and paste this right into there. It's basically NestG module users, NestG service users, and NestG resolver users. As a reminder, the G there stands for generate. Now, in our user service, we'll need to inject the Prisma service. So let's go to our users module, and we'll import the Prisma service here. So let's write Prisma service. That should auto import. Let's make that a relative import. And with that imported in our users module, we can go ahead into our users service and inject the Prisma module into our user service. So here, let's create a constructor, private read-only Prisma is a type of Prisma service. And again, let's use relative import there. Whoops, forgot to implement the constructor. Let's add some brackets. And we're ready to create our create user function. Now this will be an asynchronous function because we'll be calling basically Prisma, and we'll be calling a asynchronous function in bcrypt. Now what we want to do is we want to remove any case sensitivity from our email address. We want to hash the password. We want to save the user. And finally, we want to return the newly saved user. So here for the remove any case sensitivity from our email address, we'll have a variable called lowercase email, and that'll simply be the email parameter that we passed into our create user function to lowercase. Now here we are at hash the password, and to hash passwords, the hash basically for encryption, we'll need a third-party package called bcrypt. So let's go ahead and install that. You can run npm install bcrypt or yarn add bcrypt in my case. And since we're using TypeScript, we'll also want to add the TypeScript types for bcrypt. Great. With bcrypt installed, let's create a hashed password variable. And this will equal await bcrypt dot hash dot hash, and we'll want to actually import star as bcrypt from bcrypt here, and we'll want to hash our password input, and we'll want to do that basically have a round of 2 to the 10 times where that password is hashed. Now let's save our user. So our user will be prisma.mutation. So user will be this.prisma.mutation. We have our create function there. We'll pass it in a object with a data property, and this data property will have both the email and passwords to save. And as we said here, let's return our newly saved user. Just to quickly recap our create user function, we have a function that creates a user. It takes in an email and password string parameters. First, we take the email address and make it a lowercase email address. Then we hash the password to make sure we don't save any plain text passwords in our Prisma database. Then we go ahead and ask Prisma to create a user using the Prisma API. Now that Prisma API takes the create user API takes in an object with a data property, and that data property in itself has the arguments necessary. Lastly, we return the user. with our user service doing most of the heavy lifting of hashing the password and passing the user over to the Prisma server, writing the user's resolver should not be very hard. The first thing we'll need to do is inject the user's service into our user's resolver. To do that, of course, we'll create a constructor with private read-only users being of type user's service. Let's define a mutation using the mutation decorators applied to us by @NestJS /GraphQL. We'll create a function called createUser. This function will actually be the resolver for createUser mutation. As per the Prisma spec, this resolver will take in an argument. To accept an argument, we'll use the args decorator supplied to us again by NestJS /GraphQL. The arg will be called data. We'll call the parameter data, and let's type it. This data will be an object with an email and password properties. Yep, what am I doing? There we go. So let's go ahead and implement createUser. Again, our user's service is doing most of the heavy lifting. So our user can be defined as this.users, again calling our user's service, .createUser. The first parameter is the email, so data.email, and the second parameter is our password. And let's go ahead and return our user, since we'll need to return that user to use the mutation. To recap, the first thing we did was inject the user's service, and then we created the create user mutation, which is just a function. The mutation accepts an argument called data. Inside the data type is an object with an email of type string and a password of type string. We got the user returned by the create user in users.service, and we just return that user once more. Now, with everything done, let's go ahead and play with our new create user resolver. Back at our development server, you'll see that we hit an error that cannot find module Prisma client lib in the generated folder. Now, we're actually not using the generated folder anyway, so let's go ahead and delete the entire generated folder. Let's go ahead and delete the dist folder, and let's restart our development server. Unfortunately, I'm still hitting an error. It says Nest can't resolve dependencies of the user service. And remember, the dependency of the user service is the Prisma service. Now we need to make sure that the argument at 0 is in the user's module context. Now this is actually my fault. In the user's module, I imported the Prisma service. However, we needed to import the Prisma module. So let's go ahead and import the Prisma module, not the Prisma service. Completely sorry about that. Let's go back to our server, and it should be ready to go. Our development server is up. Now let's go into our GraphQL playground. Let's start off by creating a mutation. This mutation, let's actually restart our GraphQL playground. That way we have the new API ready. Let's create a user. And as we said, this create user resolver will take in an argument called data. This argument data will be an object that takes in an email address. So let's say hello@world.com. And it will take in a password. This password will be test1234. Super secure. So after we create our user, let's get back the ID, the email, and the password. Let's run it. And you'll see that create user created a new user with ID of 3, email of hello@world.com, and a hashed password. Now, since we passed the email property of our user type a unique decorator, we should not be able to create another user with the same email address. Let's give this a try. You'll see we have an error. A unique constraint would be violated on user. So we cannot create a new user with the same email address. Works perfectly. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please leave me a thumbs up. Please leave a comment below. Please follow me on Twitter. My name is Arian Jabari. On dev.to, ArianJNYC, or visit my website, thewebdevcoach.com. I'll see you guys later. Peace.